Okay guys, so a lot of people have been asking me to do this video, and today I'm going to oblige you with this lecture. So this is about the hierarchical structure of human language. So there are two words over here that we need to pay attention to. So what is hierarchy and what is language, and specifically what is human language. So, in this, we regard language to be the speech patterns, and also to some extent, it is transformed into written form to the extent that the written form reflects the spoken language. When you talk about a hierarchy, it is a set of elements at one level that get combined to construct elements at another level. So you have a layered structure where elements at one level combine to give elements at another level, and suppose you have several other elements, so it combines over here to give another, and then you combine them also to give a third one, and so on and so forth. So this is what is the hierarchy, and therefore it goes from the simple to the complex nature. Also important is the fact that you have these elements which are basically sequential in order, and also the fact that they are therefore linear in based on a linear organization. And then another important fact that, well, we'll come to it, that they may or may not be in a particular order depending on what we are looking at. So if you're looking at a set, so you have a set, say A, which has the elements of, say, where it does not really make a difference in the order in which you list them. Whether it is true or not over here in case of language is for us to see a little later. So elements at one level will always be, choose to constrain elements at another level, and the lower level is kind of a regulatory or grammatical nature in which, in the philosophical sense, a grammatical nature in which it is posited. So language, especially human language, is roughly, but not perfectly, hierarchical in nature, because these levels that we talk about in language, they interact with each other. They're not very strict. Hierarchies are never followed. So the low-level elements are necessarily smaller units, and the higher level is necessarily larger units. So there are 6 levels in the language hierarchy. One, you have the phonology, which are the elementary sounds and their organization. Secondly, you have morphology, which are the elementary letter to sound combinations, maybe word to sound combinations or syllable to sound combinations. The third is individual words, which is the lexical level. And so you have the syntactic level, which is the word combinations. Then you have the semantics, which is the meaning level. And then you have the pragmatics, which is the behavioral constraints on the use of language. So these are 6 basic hierarchies, and 6 basic levels, or 6 basic strata. So singular is stratum. So we can say that there are 6 strata or 6 levels of the language hierarchy. Look, you may posit some other levels, like in the intermediate levels between morphology and phonology. You may have morphophonemic levels, or below the phonological level, you could have the phonetic level and the acoustic level. So we will come to a mechanism in which you have a tier-based system, which we will explore a little later. But the first thing that need to be addressed is, why do we have a hierarchy? Why is it hierarchical? For example, if syntax is the specification of how words can be combined in terms of its rules and words, well, it cannot operate without those rules and without those words that enable the syntactic rules. In another example, what if we use syntax or we use a phonetic rule or a phonological rule which may or may not be constrained over a particular environment. So to speak, let's give an example. So let me have a basic... so you have seen that there is a syntactic and hierarchical organization which is organized in terms of a simple to a complex field. So let us posit that this is the level where you have the acoustic level, and then you have the phonetic level, and then you have a phonological level, then you can have the syllabic tier, which we call the sigma, and then you can have a level which is called the structure S, and maybe structure F, the structural and functional syntactic level, and then you have the pragmatic level. And of course, you can have a textual level. So this becomes the hierarchy of nature, of the nature of language. So the acoustic level definitely is basically based on the physical parameters, which is basically nothing but frequency and amplitude organized in a particular temporal fashion. So over time, there is a regularity in the, or a kind of a relationship in which the frequency and amplitudes of the sounds that are coming out through your vocal system is output, and they organize themselves in a physical acoustic parameter, set of parameters, which are guided by the frequency and the amplitude, and this also organizes the suprasegmental features. So you have the suprasegmentals as a part of your acoustic domain. They then get converted into phonetic and then into the phonological world, where you have the conceptual, the sensory motor stage converting into the conceptual intentional stage, depending on how they are utilized in the organization and in the coalescing of smaller materials, smaller elements into larger and larger elements. Now, as far as this hierarchy is concerned, this basically leads to what is known as the rule-governed system, which is basically also a constraint-driven system. So each level of language is constrained in many ways, in which there are four main interests for our own purposes of understanding how the hierarchy is arranged. So one is the rules, then you have the physiological organization, Then you have the regularities in terms of statistical patterns. And then you have contextual cues. So a phonological system, or say for example, a phonological system, when you're talking about this level of organization, suppose I use this, so if I'm talking about, say, this level of organization, we will be talking about rules which are organized at the phonological level. Obviously, these rules have to have some kind of physiological setting in which the articulatory parameters will become important, and therefore the statistical regularities are also ingrained within the system, and hence the contextual cues arise from these statistical parameters. So obviously these rule-based constraints, in some cases we may like to think of these constraints are these rules. So those formally they are specifiable in terms of mappings. So what kind of mappings are we talking about? So you obviously know one kind of a mapping that we have in general. You have, let me see if you can see this. So I'll draw it over here so that you can see this. You have the articulatory, the acoustic, and the auditory universes. There are three different systems, there are three different organizational systems, self-contained within themselves, but they interact and share information with each other. So these rules, therefore, are governed from the very beginning of the articulatory. So if you have an articulatory constraint, say for example, you cannot extend the tongue beyond a certain limit, or that you would require the velum to go up in a particular nature, in a particular set of utterances. So it would probably go up to a particular level and not more than that. So that is constrained, as well as it's constrained by the anatomy. Or you can move the tongue back and forth with a particular speed. So that would be a particular articulatory constraint. So it leads to certain configurational changes and certain configurational patterns that can change with respect to these constraints. And they lead to their acoustic consequences. So when you have an acoustic consequence, so you have the sound that is output from there. So these configurational constraints at the articulatory level convert into an acoustic set of statistical regularities that is present in the acoustic sound, in the acoustic signature, in the sound itself. As well as you have the contextual cues that you have already talked about in general. Now, once you have the acoustic cues, it gets converted into the auditory signal. The auditory part is what you hear. So everything that is there in the acoustic domain gets converted into a set of psychological parameters. The moment it enters the psychological parameters and convert it into the auditory domain, you transcend into a pure phonological from only the phonetic and the physical acoustic level. So you have the conceptual level, conceptual intentional level at the level of the phonetic, and then you convert it into the pure phonological level. So you have a rule-based constraint system in which in many cases these constraints are formally specifiable in terms of the mappings from one entity onto the other. Now each level of these physiological constraints generate a set of systems or subsystems at every level of the hierarchy. Each of these levels would have these set of 4 parameters at the phonetic level, the acoustic level, the phonetic level, the phonological, the syllabic, the structural functional, as well as the pragmatic, and also the textual levels. So when you put them together, you have language as a system of subsystems. And so language is also known as, as a system of systems or system of subsystems. So each of these levels of the hierarchy, each of these tiers, or each of these platforms or levels or strata. So these are all alternative names of the same thing. So all these are levels. So these hierarchies. So you go from a simple level to the complex level by organizing them in a particular way. Now, we've already talked about these physiological and articulatory constraints. So let's talk about what are the statistical constraints. So a set of constraints that are there, which may or may not be useful at this stage when you are looking at the hierarchy, but may be useful to the auditory domain, are the statistical constraints, because our brain has to make sense of all these information that is there from the acoustic cues that are present and try to organize them into some sort of a conceptual mapping between the sound that you have uttered or that is heard and the meaning structure that has to be established at the pragmatic level, or at least at the semantic level. So you could have at this level, so there is say a semantic level as well over here. So it may be a very crucial element of how the language is organized. For example, we'll see very well that frequently that it's easier to access a certain set of words that you use, say for example, a, the, of, or your name, or many of the nouns, everyday objects, or everyday activities, actions like run, happy, emotions. So these are very, very easily obtainable because they are frequent words. The statistical regularity is such that the frequency, these are high frequency words, they can be very, very easily recalled. So you have an obvious link with every part of the system. When you talk about a statistical regularity, it is also linked with your memory system. So the frequency is just one of the statistical facts, and there could be several others which are not so evident. They may be more subtle, and but they do play, obviously, a major role in this kind of a hierarchical understanding of language. Now, there is another set of constraints which are contextual constraints, where the context can serve to change the way in which a thing is interpreted. So thereby reducing the ambiguity, or even in terms of how the alteration of the significance of an utterance or a particular set of words, or the meaning or purpose or of the linguistic element or the entity may vary according to the context. And many elements at one level of the hierarchy may be able to constrain several things up above or something down below. So if you say, for example, you have a suprasegmental, which is clearly a physical parameter concerning frequency and amplitude. So if you say, for example, the word present versus present, so where you put the emphasis and stress on whether it's the first syllable or the second syllable, So the meaning changes because it changes the word class from noun to a verb. So depending on what you mean to say, so your physical utterance of the or the acoustics will get involved in how the syllabic organization would take place, and also in terms of how the semantics and the pragmatics of the situation would go. So it's not very clear cut. Obviously, there are also levels which are intermediate to all of them. Like you have Sandhi rules, which are basically phonological, syllabic, and level intermediaries. So you can have a set of morphological rules of organization, or you have what is called the, say, I can call it a mu, or the morphologic. So morphological structure, or the internal structure of words, where a phonological word is generated out of the syllables. So obviously there is some kind of a intermediate level which interact between the two. So where you can have a set of rules over here which are called the Sandhi rules or morphophonemic rules. Now these kinds of constraints are they independent of each other? They are neither necessarily nor actually independent. For example, the memory limitations of the physiological constraints may or may not influence the rules. Moreover, the rules may or may not be implemented as per the statistical regularities, or the rules themselves may be some kind of an illusory framework that is input in terms of how the organization is supposed to proceed. Now the question is language really this hierarchical? Well, it's not purely a hierarchical system. For example, there are all sorts of questions about the relationship between, say, morphology and syntax. So I showed you about the Sandhi rules. So even here, morphological and syntactic rules, there may be morphosyntactic rules over here, which might be interacting over at this level. And therefore, there may be other impurities in this particular idea that language is purely hierarchical. So when we talk about the different levels of hierarchy, as we have seen that the phonology, morphology, lexical, syntactic, semantic, the pragmatic levels, they are made up of many different elements. So we have talked in a little bit of detail about the acoustic to physical. Let's talk a little bit about the phonological tier or the phonological set of rules. It is important because this set of phonological systems establish the very rule-based system of a particular language. So what is phonology? The phonological structure is basically spoken language that is made up of many distinguishable sounds called the phonemes. Now, how are these phonemes within the language defined? They are defined by contrast. Any two phonemes are as experienced, are basically are as experienced in terms of different sounds when there is some kind of a value judgment going on. So if you have a meaning difference between all things being equal, so if there are two sounds, two sets of sounds, all things being equal, certain part of it is different from certain other part in these two sounds, everything else being equal, these two leading to differences in meaning or capturing one word which is a meaningful word and another which is a nonsensical word. So these two contrasting these two would lead us to the idea of the phoneme. So for example, you have p and b, pat and bat. So if you have pa and ba, so what are the two, how are the two different? So what makes pa into a ba? So you have, for example, you have a parameter which is an articulatory parameter, which is the voicing, which is the vibration of the vocal folds that makes it different. So when we try to distinguish between p and a b sound, paying attention to placing of where our tongues and lips and other parts of the vocal system are, you'll see that they're almost identical except the voicing that is introduced in a b and no voicing that is introduced in the p. So this difference is basically in terms of a feature called voicing, so which leads us to the set of distinctive features which I have talked about in an earlier video. Now people can very easily distinguish between the auditory outputs of these, but they can't see the vibrations. But obviously they do have a certain kind of a consequence, and it seems obvious that however trivial they may sound, many different sounds are distinguished between languages based on this kind of a criteria, and many different sounds that are actually different in one language may sound similar in another language, because people gradually lose their ability to distinguish. Say for example, you have in Japanese, ra and la distinction are not made. So you have London would be the same thing as London, or a lake would be same thing as a rake. But in English, la and ra are contrastive in nature, so you have lake has a different meaning and rake has a different meaning. Although in the Japanese case, lake and rake or London and Rondon would be rendered to be the same word. So as well as having these constraints, what are the sounds that we can hear and produce? So we have certain physiological and other cultural linguistic parameters that constrain this system. For example, there are certain sound combinations that are never found in a particular language, or there are certain sound combinations that are possible in certain languages. So that is a set of rules, again, which is governed by a set of phonotactic rules. So coming to the next level, which is the morphology, we basically determine it to be the study of morphemes. A morpheme being a smallest meaningful unit of the language that carries some kind of a meaning information, the smallest unit that carries some kind of meaning information. Now many of these words are made up of more than one morpheme, so we can make it into morphemes of affixes and suffixes. Now what is morphology used for? They're used for many different and huge arsenal of making some semantic or syntactic changes, rules, and maybe some kind of a decision or with regard to the semantics of a particular sound or a phonological word. So in the next video, I will be talking about that part of the hierarchy. Thank you.